Salam, dear friends of BookBytes, and boy, have I got a treat for you guys. We're here for a reunion, not exactly a BookBytes reunion, something a little more enticing and maybe even sinister. For those of you who have read Spud back in the day, I mean, this was quite a sensation. The Spud series came out almost 20 years ago and really captivated readers around the country and around the world. The very first of the Spud series and one of the greatest grossing, highest selling, I should say, bestsellers in South Africa came out in 2005, followed by Spud, The Madness Continues, Spud Learning to Fly, Spud Exit Pursued by a Bear. We had a fantastic time back then. And this book went all over the world, not just in book form, but in various forms of expression. And you would remember that our homegrown author, John Van De Ruit, was born in Durban and educated at Michael House and the University of KZN. His creative career as an actor, playwright, and author has spanned over 25 years. And these books, came out over the years that I mentioned. Now traveling 10 years into the beloved character's future, Spud, the reunion delivers on the promise of delivering more to thirsty readers and a new range of readers that will no doubt be picking up copies of the reunion. I mean, you've always wanted to know when a series seems to come to a halt, what next? And here you have it. So I have great pleasure in introducing and welcoming John Van De Ruit to the show this evening. John, welcome to BookBytes. It's wonderful to have this opportunity to chat to you this evening. Welcome.
Good evening, Shafinaaz, and good evening to all your people tuning in and everybody listening and watching tonight.
Fantastic. So welcome back through the Spud series. I mean, really, what took you so long?
That was one of the first questions that people asked me when I announced that there was going to be a new book. First, there was disbelief, like I was playing a cruel trick. And then there was this, what took you so long? And then after they got over that, they've been sort of excited about the new book coming out. It's a very good question. I think by 2013 or 2014, remember I was involved with the movies too, particularly the third and the fourth one, which wasn't actually filmed, but I wrote a screenplay for. So I was very busy. I'd had 4 non-stop bestsellers, and people may not know what goes on behind the scenes when you have a sort of book that's in high demand, and it's the media want to speak to you. People want you to come to their bookstores or their schools or whatever. There's a demand, and the phone rings all the time. And I had that for like 9 years solid. And whether it was films or books or a combination, I was always on book tour. I would do a book tour, but then the book tour would almost inspire more interviews and more invites to go back to more stores and whatever. So I had this 9 years on the road, and I had to step off. I almost felt like I was living this kind of celebrity Spud life, and it was great. But I also felt as an artist, as a creator, I wanted to explore other things, even if it was just to go get my life back a little bit and go traveling and experience the world again, which is a very big part of being a writer. So that's why it took so long. But I eventually, I suppose, decided, it was time to come back.
Well, obviously, the character was growing and developing in the creative mind, even while you were traveling. And before we get into the reunion, talk us through, the relatability of having a character that goes to this all-boys school and develops this group of friends. Talk us through some of the earlier books, where Spud began. Where did he begin for you as the creator and the originator, and obviously how the story progresses through the first lot of the Spud series?
Well, it was interesting. The first book, obviously, I had no idea, first of all, that it would even be published, and then that it would become like a bestseller and would reach so many people and change my life in many ways. But I'm not complaining about that. But it was absolutely a real sort of out of the blue thing that hit me. If I'd sold just a couple of thousand or 5,000 copies, I think my publishers would have been happy for publishing that book. So there was this sense of wow, and almost the Frankenstein's monster effect, where you've created something that you aren't fully in control of. and it just rolled and rolled. So then I wrote the first book, and obviously the response was amazing, and it just kept going and kept going. It was like, that's really the hallmark of books. If you're going to do well in books in South Africa, it's a small market. You can't do well for Christmas. You've got to keep selling for year upon year, near the top of the bestseller list, to actually make a living out of that. And I think people often think, oh, you've hit number one. Well, it means you sorted for the next 5 years. And it's not that case, right? But anyway, getting back to the books, I went back to my school, Michael House, in 2006, the year after Spud 1 was published, and it was already sort of caused quite a stir and what have you. And I spoke to the boys, and I was walking back to my car after the speech, and a group of boys ran up to me and then dragged me off to this den that the boys had created in the bushes, this illicit den that had been busted. And, there was big trouble brewing in the school, but they wanted to show me. And that gave me the idea for The Madness Continues, which was a book about rebellion, the Crazy Eight almost pushing, that's Spud's dormitory mates, pushing the envelope as far as they could go until the school almost bit back. And the school does bite back. And then I had 2 more years. I got to Michael House in grade 9. So people often think, why is it starting there? But that's when I started there. So I had 4 years to really fill, and the 3rd year became the year of politics, where they started pushing for prefect and trying to sort of outdo one another. And then the final year is the matric year, and as we all know, that year takes on a life of itself as you're about to step into the world and out of school, and just you are the heavy boys. You're the main mana or the main girls if you're at a girls' school. So that was it, and I felt like that I told that story in terms of school. I was never going to come back to that and try and sort of carry on from there, but during COVID, I got the idea of a 10-year reunion, and I just felt in many ways that there was something so universal about the idea, aside from it being a Spud, that if I was just writing a reunion story about a bunch of friends or sort of adversary friends getting together, it could reach people. And then also I realized that Spud never died. I stepped off the Spud roller coaster, but Spud kept selling. Every time I went out, people would find me and talk about Spud. And I realized that Spud was way bigger than me, and I'm his servant rather than vice versa, which is maybe what I felt back in 2012. I hope that gives you a good sort of backdrop to how the now 5 Spud novels have come out and emerged.
Now, it's always fascinating to hear about the writer's journey, but also when you speak about how the process eventually takes a life of its own, in a sense, and your character is more compelling you to write on. I mean, it seems like Spud suddenly had another tale to tell, which is fantastic. And I know, when I went through the reunion now, we're all at that age where 10 or 20, or in my case, 30 years later, you're thinking about what happened, back in school days. And so that's what makes this so relatable. I want you to speak a little bit about the kind of camaraderie, and almost like you're thrown together in this group at school, and you form the Crazy Eight in this case, these friends who do what they need to do, but they're so sort of inward. And it's only 10 years later on reflection that they have a very different sense of why certain people behaved in certain ways back in matric or whatever, in high school. Talk to us about the group dynamic of the boys club, the little group, the Crazy Eights, and what happens 10 years later that is so revelatory in some ways, maybe even explosive.
Thank you. And it's a good question. Looking at the Crazy Eight, they are thrown together in a dormitory, and they stay together as their house group for that year all the way. So they're kind of like thrown together. It's almost like inmates thrown into a cell together, if you like. And you know what? It's so interesting that people regard them as friends, and many of the Crazy Eight would regard them as friends, but certainly Spud, I think, is sharp enough to notice, even back then, that it's to call them genuine friends. I'm talking about caring friends who are looking out for you, and that would be a bit of an exaggeration, because it's almost more like a wolf pack. where you've got to fit in, or somebody's going to bite you, or you're going to get some grief or whatever. So there's this coercion, there's this electricity that exists because they aren't actually genuine friends. They almost sort of compadres, brothers in arms, if you like. But they somehow make a very interesting fruit salad. When I get back to them, and I haven't written these guys for 11 years, and got back in, and once when the book reaches the reunion section, it just was amazing to step back into their slightly older selves and then still feel like, wow, what a cast. It's not just like one or two crazy or quite big characters that hit you full on. It's like all 8 of them have their own thing going on. So you know what? When they return to the reunion, there's definitely, I don't know, I've spoken to a lot of people on my book tour who've talked to me about their 10-year reunion, particularly people around Spud's age in this book now, in the late 20s, who are experiencing similar pressures. Are you going to get married, have kids? Are you, what job are you going to, you just got to be an adult now. And I think when I speak to those people and they talk about their 10-year reunion, it is the most difficult, because the key thing is that people all want to go back to school and prove to others that they've made something of their lives. And obviously this is very difficult for Spud, who hasn't made a whole lot of his 20s. And he fears everybody else is going to be a millionaire and styling it. So there is this real sense of difficulty about 10-year reunions. And when you speak to people, they say 30-year reunions, and you might be pleased to hear this. From there, it gets better and better, because people have put aside their fronts and trying to impress and what have you, and they're just there for the people, which is what it really should be. But in this reunion, definitely everybody's arriving with either a chip on their shoulder, an agenda, or an axe to grind. And, that combination, or a desperation to make the thing a success. And, that combination makes it, for me, quite explosive and also potentially very fun.
And I think you've used that vehicle very, very successfully in bringing out the fun aspects, because I think in that first 10 years, you're right, there's a sense of competitiveness that comes through from school. And even though everyone's concept of who the other person was is frozen in that timeline, it's almost like but I'm not driving this kind of car, and I haven't accomplished this and this and this. And so all the checks and balances aren't quite in place. It's quite humbling for them to realize they can just fall into being who they were. I loved that. Without giving away too much about the reunion, yes. I love how the apprehension becomes a sort of, okay, this is what it is, and they kind of let loose at some point.
It is. And it's like that, particularly for Spud, because he's chosen this acting career. And I think people who've been actors would understand that there's 2 levels. Like, for example, every time you're in a play, it generally, back in the old days, it's featured, whether it's social media or in the newspapers or just in the media. Your picture would be out there quite a lot, maybe on billboards or something for the show. But all of that is like marketing and publicity, right, that you're doing for your show, and you are like writing the press release, and then people are reading the press release that an editor has just put into the paper, and they're going, wow, you're doing so well. And it doesn't accurately reflect, because they see the glamorous side, like, oh, you're doing a show here at the Playhouse, or you're at the Snedden, or you're going to Joburg, or whatever, but that doesn't actually reflect on how you're doing financially. And the fact is that, not to give too many spoilers away, but poor old Spud has now got a gig at a supermarket where he's being a clown, giving out biscuits for a marketing company to make ends meet. And he's earning quite good money from that as an actor. But it's the indignity of that he can't admit that to his mates, obviously, that he's got a clown outfit in his boot of his car, that Monday morning after the reunion, he's got to go back to the hypermarket by the sea. And so there are those things that make him almost go, my skin will crawl if I go back. But obviously he does, because it wouldn't be called the reunion if he doesn't.
And there's almost like this surrender to the idea that the hustle plays for the dream, no matter what it looks like.
That's it. That's it, exactly. And it's coupled with that also that Spud has sort of got a bit risk averse, because he's had so many sort of knocks in a way. And that's what a young actor does feel like, it's constant knocks and missing out on things that you thought you were going to get the role, or botching the sort of whatever the start. You're doing whatever it is. You can blow it, and sometimes you feel you blow it, but actually the world doesn't look on like that. But it feels so personal when it does to you. But it does to Spud. And I think that also, because he takes himself so seriously, say more seriously than I would myself, I find so much of the comedy comes out of that. The sort of how the world conspires against this man who's trying to get it together, and trying to take himself to another level, I suppose. I mean, I think that's always the underpinning of Spud, is that people call it coming of age, other people call it Bildungsroman, the genre, but it is like the sort of moral, spiritual, personal test for the character. In each book, there's always a challenge, a conflict he has to overcome. And in so doing, he learns about himself and the people around him, like the Crazy Eight, that empowers him more to the next year. And I suppose we like to think of life like that, in years and overcoming things. And life is often that. It's overcoming challenges and then almost getting to the next challenge and then trying to overcome that.
I think it was really interesting that when you choose a 10-year timeline, the age 28 is quite significant, because if you look at every 7 years being something developmental and almost like a springboard onto the next phase of your life, so to speak. So I found that very special, because he's able to see very differently, see his friends very differently while reflecting on the past. And so there were these philosophies that kind of fit together in the story, even though it's hugely fun and entertaining. Great social commentary and life commentary as well through the book. Let's talk about the packing order, so to speak, right? Because I mean, so the group gets together when they're in high school, and there's generally the sense of who's the alpha, and then you come across 10 years later, and this is not so predictable anymore, because based on the surprises that come up,
Yes.
who's done well. Yeah, talk to us about some of that change and that dynamic, because that I think we can all identify with.
Well, if we go back to the earlier books, it was a very clear hierarchy where Rambo was the guy in charge. He was the big rebel. He was fearless in many ways of punishment, staff, repercussions, what have you. And there was something almost Machiavellian about him, manipulative, got them to do almost his bidding. And this kind of gold Spud. And I think by the end of Spud 4, Spud was becoming his own man. He wasn't just being reactive and, being pushed around by these heavy characters and interesting characters. But, there were other interesting boys. And I always found this at school, that hierarchies were never quite as simple as people would make out. Yes, you could loosely define somebody as a rebel or a jock or a artist or whatever. You could loosely do that, but within these boundaries there were different sort of behaviors that manifested. For example, Simon is an interesting character because he's head boy, or was head boy at school, first team cricket, a real star, but he wasn't the alpha male in the dormitory. He was very much a second or even third down the dormitory. And then you've got a guy like Boggo, who is quite interesting because he's fast talking, flashy, witty, sharp, difficult to sort of argue against, and quite scathing about people. So he also occupies a sort of place. And then you've got a Vern who's called Rain Man because he's literally nuts. And nobody's quite sure how he got it to school in the first place and how he made it through school, but there's something about him that's endearing as well. And he has his own power because he has a fearlessness, because he almost doesn't have an awareness, So there are all these lovely dynamics coming back. I wanted to not just return to the old dynamic, because that would have been almost return to boyhood if it was just Rambo going, all right, boys, this is how it's going to go. So we initially think that it looks like Garth Garlic, the most unlikely character, is maybe leading the Crazy Eight, but he's only organizing, and obviously he doesn't have the authority. And what happens is a sense of almost everyone's stepping back and going, who's going to be the leader if Rambo doesn't step forward and lead? And that presents a very interesting dynamic, because leading the Crazy Eight is like leading a group of cats. I mean, trying to herd cats is these things are going everywhere. So, ultimately it's Spud actually has to step in to try and save this reunion from going seriously pear-shaped. And he does it in very funny ways, initially in a very dishonest way, by just saying what he thinks should be said at any moment and slipping blame. But ultimately, I think one of the great joys of this, for me, writing this book, was the way that you can see the man he's grown into by how he sort of resolves it and how he leaves the school wiser. That philosophy that you mentioned, the sense of his learnings, which returns us to the genre of Bildungsroman or coming of age, that those learnings have made him a better man and make the reader feel like perhaps he can now overcome those obstacles that have been holding him back.
And I think in some ways, each of them reflects on how being part of this group at high school level shaped who they were later on. Even though I notice a few of them discard, like Spud has in his mind each of the nicknames for the guys, but a lot of them don't identify with that nickname anymore because of the kind of changes that life has brought in them.
That's right. And obviously at school, many of those nicknames, or certainly at the school I went to, were almost deliberately demeaning. You very seldom, it was more only the rugby guys and the sort of real legends who got cool nicknames. Most of us got terrible nicknames that were demeaning. And, so that's why I wanted to, when I went back right to the start, writing when I was a young man, the first Spud, I wanted that element that you carry your nickname around like it's a bit of a, it's a real drag on your life, because everybody calls you by that and you almost flinch. Eventually you get used to your nickname and you sort of wear it with as badge of pride kind of thing. But it's that element of Spud that I think people recognize in South African schools. Even people who enjoyed school will recognize that there were dodgy characters. There were characters that were not necessarily out for everyone's best interests, and nutters and people who were just like weird. And then you meet them later in life and you go, you know what, they've had those rough edges chipped off them too. Everybody life has a way of disciplining you and pulling you back down to earth. And just, you can see how people get humbled by life. And I suppose I wanted that too, even for Rambo, a sense of, I didn't want him to bring him back all controlling like this dark lord Voldemort. He had to be have a little bit of a dark history himself, which I found interesting to trace.
Let's talk about our Limpopo boykie, Mad Dog. We cannot miss out on the kind of, I don't want to say stereotype, but I mean, he was always ready with a plan. So let's talk a little bit about that character.
Well, you know what? I was only learned tonight that you are Limpopo based. So I was like, there's a good many jokes about the Boerewors curtain and that. So I do apologize to listeners from Limpopo. I've only had good experiences in the Limpopo, and my wife's family has a farm up in Louis Trichardt, as I was saying to you, just as mitigation. But, Mad Dog almost represents that sort of, that uber caveman South African figure. And it's a dude who's like heavily linked to the bush, and this family are farmers, and they've always been in farms. So they always are like barefoot. They're the kind of guys who walk into shops in the city barefoot and, with a bakkie. And, there's just a sense of, I love incongruence. And obviously incongruence is when it's like a fish out of water kind of thing, where Mad Dog doesn't really fit at a school like Michael House in a way. If you look at his temperament, if you look at his life, there's something about him that's still like quite 1846, or 90, like a settler, that could be 100 years back. But ultimately, what you get with Mad Dog is this warm-heartedness, this bearish, lionish thing where he's going to probably injure you when he hugs you, but he's going to hug you with such love and relish that you can't help sort of falling in love with him. And I think there's a line somewhere where Spud says, he's a terrible vandal, a mad dog, and this hasn't changed in 10 years, but somehow you just feel quite happy to be accomplice to all his crimes because he's such a charming fella. And he brings a sort of buzz, and I missed him in the last two novels. I expelled him. And I obviously killed Gecko, so I'm quite brutal with my characters, but I also know that you have to do that sometimes, and having a big cast allows you to take some big choices. But he did get expelled, Mad Dog, because he doesn't really understand when to, after he's particularly been drinking, when enough is enough. And you might have seen this in Polokwane. I don't know. I think Polokwane is more civilized than further north, Zanin and places like that, northeast. But that sense of like where they get wild at parties, their clothes come off and they're dancing on their buckies and they're just crazy. And I wanted to bring that element to the Crazy Eight, because if you look at the Crazy Eight, aside from maybe Vern, they all quite contain characters in a way that have quite focused natures, whereas Mad Dog is almost just like this wild man who lives in the present, and he brings the element of danger. So I've loved having him back, and he fitted in so well at the reunion because everybody wasn't fitting in well, and he just comes in and it's like, no, I'm going to pull this back the Limpopo way. We're going to have a party here, and he just, I won't give it away what he does, but his vandalism leads to a sort of happy atmosphere eventually after they've had their acrimonious start.
I think all the apprehension is cleared up, which is what makes this so satisfying and so brilliant and so relatable, as I said. And a story for the young ones who are just coming out of high school, because they're all feeling like they're going to miss everyone, and then life will just kind of take over. And just to know that I hope they feel in 10 years' time real thirst to meet their friends again. What is your hopes for Spud now that you've re-engaged? You've obviously got a wide readership around the country and around the world, and you cover with your characters, you cover every taste of South Africa and South Africanness. But what is your hope for a new readership picking up Spud and really taking on the characters?
That is my hope. I hope always to connect with readers. That's why I go on these big book tours, because that is really my joy. I guess for some people, the writing of the novel is the joy, and it does give me huge creative pleasure to write a Spud novel, because I throw so much at it. I think people sometimes think I just have this pile of diaries that I just jot down and edit, and it's not like that. But it's such an exciting thrill to develop it. But it's also a slog too, because it takes a lot of time, and you're going over it all the time. But I would love to reconnect people to the Spud series, either people who just didn't get into the school series, and maybe the idea of reading a story set in a boarding school was, not quite for them. I mean, a lot of people it was for, but on the other side, just an element of being able to, as adults, find him as a young adult, not an old adult, but a youngish adult, and then see again what you saw before, like you see your life reflected through Spud's, I suppose. That's what I feel happens with Spud, is people see a lot of their own life, their own characters from their life, their own school, their own friendship groups. Characters often get nicknamed after them, or this is Rambo, this is Spud, I need to meet these people who they've nicknamed in their groups. So I guess I would love to, I never, how do I say this? I've got to be diplomatic. But when I returned to Spud, I wasn't just thinking of it as one book. I was hoping that the response would be big enough, and that was like a thermometer test of are people who loved Spud back then, are they still going to love it now? Would they like a new Spud book now? And I suppose the first initial replies to that are yes, yes, yes. So that is very exciting, because it then perhaps opens the door for the next step in this journey. And I think readers, I wouldn't go 10 years ahead. I'd almost continue, if not straight on, but in the not too distant future, after the reunion ends, I would carry on the story, almost like we did before, having a set of novels at a certain time and then having another set at another time. That would be an amazing thing. And if filmmakers or television makers could follow and do what they did before, that would be incredible too. But that I think I might be asking for too much. But certainly so far it's been so thrilling to feel that not just we like Spud, but we love Spud, and how much it means to so many people around the country. That's been beautiful.
John, thank you so much for the time you've given us this evening and for this incredible window into the world of Spud 10 years later. I know that many readers will be rushing out to buy and to get to know Spud all over again. We wish you everything of the best with the run over the next few weeks and months of launches.
Thank you, Shafinaaz. It's been great to be on BookBytes.
And so there you have it. You heard from homegrown author John Van De Ruit with the famous Spud series, that is the Reunion Guard, and get a copy. It would be a great gift for the holidays and a great way to get into this series. That's it from us this weekend. Assalamu alaikum from BookBytes.